It's a great pleasure this morning to introduce Tom Nichols. Tom has had a multifaceted career as an academic, an author, an international specialist, and a policy advisor. He's currently professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in Newport and an adjunct professor of national security affairs at the Harvard Extension School. A prolific author, Tom has written The Death of Expertise, which was a bestseller translated into 11 languages, as well as No Use, Nuclear Weapons and U.S. National Security, and Eve of Destruction, The Coming Age of Preventative War. Now, The Death of Expertise drew so much attention that Tom was named by Politico as one of the 50 people whose ideas are, quote, blowing up American politics. Tom has also taught courses on nuclear war and Russian affairs at Dartmouth and Georgetown. As well, Tom is a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a senior associate at the Carnegie Council in New York, and an active contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today. In the late 1980s, Tom put in a stint in the U.S. Senate, where he worked as a national security advisor for Senator John Hines. Despite all of the above, what really stuck out to me in Tom's resume was the fact that he is a 5-time Jeopardy champion. So Tom today will talk about first the key concepts in his book, The Death of Expertise, and then he'll focus on a number of front-burner issues, including where the U.S. stands militarily on the global scene, the outlook for NATO in the age of Trump, and the implications for our withdrawal, recently announced, from the INF Intermediate Nuclear Weapons Treaty. So, Tom, there's a lot to talk about, and we really appreciate your joining us today. So it's all yours.
Well, it's very nice to be with you, even by long distance. So thank you very much for having me. I was asked to talk a bit about the book itself, and I always start by answering a question I think a lot of people have, which is why I would even write a book like this, because it has such an obnoxious title. And it really almost kind of dares you to disagree with it, because we all know that expertise isn't dead. We're all experts. I'm sure sitting right there in the audience, there are experts of many kind. What I really meant by this was that we're undergoing a period in our social history, in a development in which we have. Can everybody hear me okay?
We're good. Okay.
Oh, okay. Where we really don't respect the idea of expertise. We think expertise is wonderful, but we're all convinced that we're all experts. That was the thing that was different that spurred me to write the book. It's totally normal for people not to trust experts or to want a second opinion from experts, to be concerned or feel anxious when experts argue with each other. What's different now is that people literally say, I know more than an expert. This actually happened to me where my background is primarily in Russian affairs. And for 30 years, I've been working on things related to Russia and strategic, the Russian-American strategic competition, nuclear weapons, all this stuff. And there was about 5-6 years ago, a young person who didn't like something I was saying about Edward Snowden and Russia said, Tom, I don't think you understand Russia. Let me explain Russia to you. And that's when I stopped and I said, no, we won't be doing that anymore. And that was what was different. That's what spurred me to write the essay that eventually became the book, because people seem very comfortable now just explaining experts field of expertise back to those experts. People don't walk into their doctors, for example, and say, well, you've told me I need to do certain things, and I'd like to get a second opinion. I'd like to talk to another doctor. I'd like to, explore my options here a bit. Instead, they walk into their doctor's office and they say, here's what's wrong with me, and here's what you're going to do. And here's what you're going to prescribe me, and here's the procedure. I mean, this has gotten really extreme. A pediatric surgeon in the Midwest came up to me after I gave a talk, and he said, people walked up with their, and I talk about this in the paperback version of the book, the revised edition came out about a year ago, where he said that a couple walked up to him with a toddler and said, here's the procedure we're engaging you to do. And the doctor said, I don't recommend that procedure. It's very dangerous. And I think it's not indicated for your child. I think it would be a mistake. And they said, we didn't come for your advice. We've already chosen the procedure. This is like walking into a car dealership and saying, look, we want the leather seats and the CD player, and we don't want any guff about it. It's kind of a funny story until you realize that the doctor refused to do it. The parents went and found a different doctor, and the child, in fact, ended up gravely injured. This happens to a lot of people, and it's not just in the professions, because I've also had people object when I talk about this and say, well, you have a PhD, you just think all you PhDs should run the world. I don't. I think maybe some of us should help with that, but I certainly don't want people with PhDs running the world, since most of us can't balance our own checkbooks. But you also see this in the trades. I've had people working on my house who will tell you, ask people that you encounter in your daily life, plumbers, electricians, contractors. People think nothing of it to walk up to an electrician who is surrounded by 15 dangling wires of death. And people walk up and say, what are you using up there? What are you putting in there? As if they would know, as if they have any idea what the answer would mean. I had a house fire. I wrote about this in a piece in the LA Times about a year and a half ago, where I said, look, I'm an expert, but I'm a useless expert when it comes to that. I had a house fire and all these folks were in my home, and I realized my job was to stay out of the way. There was a guy that was fixing the wiring, and a plumber that was putting back the hot water, and a contractor that was fixing the joists. And I basically said, well, anybody needs to know about nuclear weapons, I'll be right over here. But I think you would be surprised at how often people explain the law to lawyers, explain medicine to doctors, explain house construction to contractors. And why is this? And the more I thought about it when I was writing the book, the more I realized that the underlying problem here is narcissism. That we are in the middle of I would say a 40 or 45-year-long epidemic of narcissism. It predates the internet. I'll talk about 3 areas where I think this has been a problem, but it's not the internet. The internet makes it worse, but this has been around for a while. I mean, remember, those of us that are old enough will remember we used to call the 1970s the me decade. So this has been around for some time. I should also add, by the way, that everything I say here does not represent the views of the United States government or any agency of the government. So what caused this death of expertise? What caused this problem that has me so concerned? Well, I think there are a lot of areas that contributed to this rise of narcissism, but I'll lay out 3. And the first I'll start with is education. Excuse me. I think one of the things that struck me, I grew up in the 1960s. In case anybody's trying to guess, I'm about 8 years old. And I noticed in K through 12, and as I moved into becoming a college teacher, that we moved from being a knowledge-based method of education, from using a knowledge-based method of education to a therapeutic method of education. That is, we don't really ask students what they know, we ask them what they feel. how do you, it's one thing to learn math, but how did you feel about it? How do you feel about the class? Do you feel included? Did you feel respected? Did you enjoy the course? We do this in colleges all the time. Did you enjoy the course? Was it fun? Did you like it? Now, I have been a department chairman and an administrator, and I've had to read thousands of teaching evaluations, including my own, and I say this because this is not a matter of sour grapes. I've never had a problem with my student evaluations. I've had a very successful career as a teacher, but it does strike me as somewhat absurd that we are asking teenagers to evaluate mid-career professionals as though they are peers. And that is a problem. You'd be surprised at how many institutions, including my own for a while, that people still just refer to the students as our peers or our clients or our customers. As I say in the book, when a teacher who says, well, it's an equal relationship. I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. Any teacher who says that is a bad teacher, in my view. It's not an equal exchange. If you're sitting behind the desk giving grades, the assumption is they're learning more from you. And I think that has contributed to the rise of universal, first we have universal education, but it's contributed to the rise of an educated class of people, both coming out of high school and college, who say, look, I'm already pretty smart. I don't need to know anything else. I can master anything because I've always been told that I can master just about anything. A second area that's a problem here is the media. And not in the way you think. This is not the usual, the media is too left-wing, the media is too right-wing. I mean, there is some of that problem. But the bigger problem is that there is so much bandwidth available for media now that people can tailor and curate their own streams of information so that they can spend all day watching television or reading newspapers on the internet and never really encounter an idea they hadn't heard before or that they disagree with. People find it amazing. My younger students find it amazing one thing I forgot to say about education, an obvious part of this is grade inflation. When everybody's walking out with an A-, it's very hard to convince people that they still have things to learn. I got an A in a class once where I thought I'd learned it all, and I walked up to the professor, all full of the young swagger that 20-something who has just aced the class could have. And my professor was a Jesuit priest at Georgetown, and I said, Merry Christmas, Father. It was a Christmas party. I said, Merry Christmas, Father. What do you say? Peace on earth, goodwill towards men. And he just looked over his glasses at me and he said, what I say to you, Mr. Nichols, is repent. Which was a good way of reminding me that, I still had a long way to go in my education, and that I probably shouldn't be walking up to a 60-year-old professor and Jesuit and talking to him as though getting an A made us colleagues in the faculty lounge. So this question of the media and the bandwidth that needs to be filled, when younger people are always amazed when I tell them that the evening news used to be 15 minutes long and it didn't make any money. They're stunned by this. My mother-in-law always talks about how much she misses John Cameron Swayze, and Timex watches and these kind of quick news bites that were 10 minutes long. What pushed the evening news into being a half an hour, of course, as some of us of a certain age can remember, is Vietnam. But even then, you still had a very limited stream of information, and I don't know that that was a better time. I don't think that was a better time. You had 3 old white guys reading corporate curated information streams from New York City, all sitting within blocks of each other in Midtown Manhattan, occasionally in Washington. I think it's better now that the news is more diverse, that there are more diverse voices, but there is too much time to fill. CNN did not pioneer this, by the way. This is something that people are always surprised to remember. What really began the chyrons and the little constant glued to your set was ABC's Nightline during the Iranian hostage crisis. That's when networks figured out that you could make a bundle by gluing people to their set with endless crisis coverage. Maybe some of you remember, Nightline, where it began, day 302, America held hostage. And usually the opening was, in today's news, nothing happened. They're still there. So now we're going to have to talk for a half an hour. Well, that's now become, the average person has 118 television channels. And the news networks and the cable news networks are constantly trying to fill that time. So you get several problems. First of all, the networks have become stovepiped and segregated into certain audiences. If you're conservative, you watch Fox. If you're a liberal, you watch MSNBC. The default setting for most people is CNN, but there is headline news. Apparently, Court TV is coming back, which I think is a terrible idea. There are, CNBC, Bloomberg, 100 sports channels. You can spend all day telling someone, yes, of course I watch the news, but you didn't really. You walked past a big screen that had ongoing video newspaper, kind of like wallpaper stuck to your wall, and you didn't really watch the news. I always laugh about people say I watched the news. I remember my father watching the news in the 60s and the 70s because you could only get that half hour of it, and you couldn't talk to him during the news. I mean, if once the news was on, the half hour of local news and the half hour of international news, and my father literally would just kind of give you the hand and say, "Can't talk watching the news." That was it. I like to say that my father used to watch the news aerobically, but that's gone now. People treat the news like a big kind of buffet table of junk food, and they kind of graze it, and they tune into personalities they happen to like, and they change the channels when it's personalities they don't like. And they essentially now, instead of getting those corporate curated streams of information, everyone curates their own stream. And they believe this creates the illusion of being really well informed. They say, well, I saw on the news. When what they mean is, I saw Sean Hannity tell me, or I saw Lawrence O'Donnell say, and that's not the same thing as being well informed. Pretty much after about 7 o'clock, everything is commentary on the news. And when I try and tell people that the remedy to this is to read one of the 4 or 5 national newspapers of record, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, whatever it is, they shake their heads and they say, that's not objective enough for me. I need objective. And what they really mean is, I want someone who already agrees with me. People don't watch the news so much as they hunt around in the news to find stuff that already agrees with them. On this, Fox is the worst offender by a million miles. But all of the networks, I would say, play this game to some extent, particularly after about 7 p.m. Finally, there is the problem of the internet, and I left it for last because it's the most recent thing. The internet has, I am not a technophobe. Again, I'm 58 years old, so I came of age kind of when the internet did. My first year teaching at Dartmouth, I was the only person in the entire government department who was at all computer savvy enough to constitute the computer committee. So this was in the late 1980s, and I was pretty much by default the computer committee. I was an avid and early adopter of computer technology, but I am really concerned about the baleful influence it's had on our politics and on our ability to think straight about any matters of fact, because we all walk around with one of these in our pockets, and it's an instant, it's a magic box. It answers any question that we ask him. It doesn't tell us what we need to know, and it doesn't give us the right answers. It just answers any stupid thing that we demand it tell us. If you really want to believe that Barack Obama was born in Africa, this will tell you. It will say, yes, he was. If you want to believe that, Donald Trump was sent here by aliens to steal our water, somebody probably has a website that says that. I used to make the joke that if you want to believe that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of a pizza parlor, you could find that, but that's actually on there, and people took it seriously enough that at least one person showed up with a gun. The internet, I think, has become dangerous in that sense, and mostly to older people. The studies that I shouldn't say we, that I haven't done, but that have been done by experts on these matters, mostly people who are retired or over 55 have a tendency to accept what's on the internet too uncritically, because it's a new form of communication to them. So Facebook in particular is dangerous for kind of the retired generation. Younger people are a little more savvy about it, but they have an Achilles heel as well. They don't understand that the internet does not have an editor. They think that younger people make the dreadful mistake of believing that everything that exists on the internet was put there by fate or God or by as a kind of a natural occurrence like rainfall. And they forget sometimes that the internet is not a library. I have young students say this to me all the time. They say, Professor Nichols, why do we really need, why do we need to worry about libraries and bricks and mortar libraries? We have the internet. That's a library. To which I always tell them, no, the internet is a dumpster, not a library. It's full of whatever people threw in there. Sometimes you might find a Gutenberg Bible or, a really good study on foreign affairs. But you're just as likely to find nothing but garbage and pornography and conspiracy theories and all kinds of other nonsense. There's about 1 billion websites in the world, and overwhelmingly they stink because they're put there by ordinary people who don't know what they're doing. I used to have a blog, by the way, and I took it down because I was trying to be a better example to my students. Blogs do not have editors. And I just thought it was inappropriate to keep writing things on a blog where no one was fact checking me or editing me. So my lesson to you, and as it is to my students, is anything you read, if it doesn't have a fact checker, if it doesn't have an editor, if it doesn't have a corrections page, then it's not really a source you can trust. It's turned us all into know-it-alls. I think the easy access to kind of instant factoids. I'm not sure how many of you in the audience remember the old TV series Cheers, but there was a guy at the end of the bar, the mailman, Cliff. And Cliff was the bar know-it-all, and he annoyed the hell out of everybody because he was always saying things like, well, it's a known fact, when it was not a known fact, or studies have shown, and there were no studies that showed that. The problem with this little box is that it's turned us all into Cliff. We're all that guy. We say, well, no, what is what was the Cold War really about? We all sit there and we say, well, hold on, I'll tell you. It says here the Cold War. That's not really how we learn things. That's just a jumble of unrelated facts that were thrown there, sometimes by well-meaning experts or academics or professionals. Sometimes it was put there by your grandmother. Sometimes it was put there by the killers from ISIS who run a website. So you have to be very careful with the internet. And I think it's given us, I think the other way it's undermined knowledge is it's given us the ability to read and learn things without having to interact with human beings. So we all spend way too much time sitting right where I'm sitting right now, in front of an electronic box without really interacting with other human beings. And that encourages the kind of arrogance and narcissism and sense of isolation that creates this resistance to further learning. So that's the book. I don't know what to do about it. My answer was basically to harangue people like I'm doing now, and to write a book about it that I hope people will read. My big fear is that we will return to more respect for expertise, but it will happen after a disaster. That we will finally make the kind of mistake that led to World War II. Now, remember, the height of expertise in America and in post-war Europe was the 40 years roughly between 1945 and 1985. And why was that? Why were experts more respected than ever in that period? Well, it was because we were rebuilding a world torn apart by war. That's when experts got together and created the Bretton Woods Agreement and created the United Nations and created arms control treaties and created international postal unions that work. I try to explain to my students and to everybody else that you live in a world that works because of experts. Even the simplest things you do. What we're doing right now, with me sitting in Rhode Island, speaking to you in New York, require not just technological experts, but planners, public officials, people to lay down the cable. I mean, it took the efforts of experts, lawyers. It took the efforts of a lot of experts. I'll leave aside this part of my talk by answering a question I think a lot of you probably already have, which is, all of this may be true, but haven't experts really screwed up horrendously on occasion? To which I will say a couple of things. First of all, yes, experts are human beings. We make mistakes. There are doctors that have amputated the wrong leg. They take out the wrong kidney. That will happen because human beings are fallible. We are also prone to bad behavior, just like the rest of you. We will lie, cheat, steal, falsify, engage in fraud. One sign of an expert or professional community, as many of you who are professionals probably already know, is that we do our best to police ourselves. Bad doctors, the answer to encountering a bad doctor is not to believe that you know more about doctors, it's to go and find better doctors to keep tabs and to render judgment. Now, sometimes that process fails. My profession in academia is full of people who are bad teachers and lousy researchers, and somehow we just can't seem to get rid of them, but that's how sometimes it goes. There are dentists who are lousy at pulling teeth and always will be. You'd still probably rather have the worst dentist in New York than try and do it yourself. With that said, I'm going to add one more thing about experts being wrong, and that'll lead us into foreign policy. Because I think a lot of times people scapegoat experts. The public wants things that are either irreconcilable or contradictory, or things they believed they wanted and told experts to make them happen, and then are very upset to find out that it didn't go the way they had hoped. It may surprise you to find that most experts in international affairs, for example, now I was not one of them, were quite strongly against the Gulf War. That was not really an expert judgment. In fact, dozens of international relations experts took out a full-page ad in the New York Times and said, don't do this. This is a bad idea. Bankers told you to take out big loans before the Great Recession. Economists did not. Bankers are the people who want to sell you a car. Economists are the people who tell you that buying a Lexus this year is not a good idea. So a lot of the things that the public points to as failures of expertise, the Great Recession, the Iraq War, even Vietnam, are, I would argue, not so much failures of expertise, but failures of the public and the experts and the political elites who serve them, who serve the public, and those are three different groups of people, to communicate and to cooperate to make better public policy. I think one thing that always makes me crazy as an expert is when people conflate me with the elites. I worked for a senator who was the billionaire heir to a food conglomerate. He was a United States senator. He was fantastically wealthy. He was the elite. I was the expert. I advised. He voted. He was the one who had to run for office. And so I think we need to be a little more careful about what we want from experts. A classic example is, and this happened during the Obamacare debates when people called their congressman and said, I want you to overturn Obamacare, but I want you to keep the Affordable Care Act. I mean, I don't know what you do in a case like that. People say Washington doesn't listen to us. My answer is Washington listens to you too much and tries to do everything you're telling it, and it's impossible. It's simply impossible to do all of the things that the public thinks that experts and their elected officials can do. All right, with that said, that leads me into foreign policy, where things become even more complicated because the public's literacy about politics is immensely low. I mean, we're talking about the fact that about half the American public can't name the three branches of government. Now, when that goes to foreign policy, where the knowledge is considerably more esoteric, that gets even worse. I usually put up a slide. It probably won't translate here, but it's a picture, it's a map of the world going from the Persian Gulf all the way to the middle of the Pacific, from Australia up to Siberia. And it's covered in these pretty blue dots. And each dot, as it turns out, represents the guess of an American adult about where North Korea is. About 36% of the American public, including college-educated Americans, got it right. So that's about a third of the public. The rest of them think that North Korea is in Sri Lanka, it's in Australia, it's in Siberia, it's in the Arabian Gulf. They have no idea where North Korea is. They would have done better by throwing darts. Now, how do we make policy under this kind of situation? Well, we don't. What happens is foreign policy goes adrift, falls into the hands of a very small number of people who understand these issues, and you get policies that you may not like. I was not a fan of the Obama era policies about Russia, because I thought that President Obama kicked the can down the road about Russia because he was too obsessed with getting a deal with Iran. I would go back to those good old days because I am appalled by President Trump's approach to Russia, which seems to be, I can't even quite get my arms around it. The United States government bureaucracy, which again, I don't speak for, has a particular approach to Russia. They're still on kind of autopilot from 7, 8, 10 years ago, trying to move sanctions, keep Russian oligarchs from engaging in mischief around the world, keeping bad guys from Russia from entering the United States. The White House has a completely different view of Russia, which is that the president trusts Vladimir Putin more than he trusts the FBI, the CIA, and the rest of his national security folks. I think this has led to a very dangerous situation in Russian-American relations, where the Russians feel very much that they can do as they please, particularly in Europe. And they're using that space to run to intimidate the Europeans. They've kind of kept us out of it because that's always been a goal of Russian foreign policy, is to divorce the United States from Europe, to get us out of the Atlantic game, to push us into isolationism, and to get us to just get back across our ocean and stay there. This is why I think NATO is in a very particularly perilous situation. And by the way, I was not a big fan of rapid NATO expansion. But again, the American public just wasn't engaged on this. President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama said, hey, why don't we make NATO bigger? And millions of Americans said, whatever, I'm watching TV. I don't know where, Montenegro is, go ahead. And so it just happened without a national debate. We've now extended the American security guarantee to 29 countries. And, when I was a kid, it was 15. We've almost doubled the size of NATO, and we haven't really had much of a national debate about The Russians have taken advantage of this to very quietly but very forcefully say to the Europeans, "You're on your own, and don't ever forget it. Don't think that the Americans are ever going to show up here and help you, because they won't. President Obama wasn't really interested in you. President Trump actively hates you, and there's no way that the Americans are going to show up and be there for you. So when, if anything bad happens, just remember who the big dog on the block is, and it's us, Russia." That's one of the reasons I was against pulling out of the INF Treaty. I wrote a piece about it in Foreign Affairs about a week and a half ago, and it's online. If you'd like to find it, you can find it at Foreign Affairs under my name. I was against pulling, even though the Russians are cheating. There's no doubt about it that the Russians are cheating. I mean, that's not even and in fact, I at a conference some years ago, I actually confronted a couple of Obama administration officials about it, saying, "Look, Russia's cheating. What are we going to do about this?" And again, I think their approach was to kick the can down the road. They were more interested in Iran. They assumed, I think as a lot of people did, that there was no urgency to deal with a lot of things because they just assumed by default that Hillary Clinton would win the election and all that stuff would be taken care of in another Democratic administration down the line. The Trump administration's reaction to Russian cheating has been to say, you don't seem to like this treaty. You know what? We don't either. John Bolton has never liked this treaty. The Trump administration is full of people who do not like multilateral or even bilateral treaty arrangements. They don't like anything that limits the United States or its abilities to pursue weapon systems or its own narrower interests in the world. And so they turned to the Russians and said, your penalty for cheating on a treaty is that we're just going to drop the treaty, walk away, and go arms race the Chinese, because that's another reason we keep getting it. We have to exit the treaty so that we can go get into an arms race with China in the Pacific. None of this makes any sense. The Russians, I think the Russian approach to the INF Treaty has been to say, please don't throw us into that briar patch, when in fact they're more than happy to see the United States just sort of wash their hands of this. It's kind of the same approach the Iranians have had to the Trump administration pulling out of the Iran deal. The Iranians have said, great, we signed it. We look like good guys. We've gotten a lot of the advantage we want out of this. We've normalized relations with the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians. And if you Americans want to take a walk, that makes us look great. Don't let the door hit you in the rear end on the way out. The Trump administration has found, I would argue, the most wrong way to do most things, even when they are things that I would normally agree with. I mean, I think the Iran deal was flawed, but I think staying in it and putting the screws to the Iranians even harder was the only way to go at this point. I don't know that I would have gotten into it, but I certainly wouldn't have left it this way. Doing something about the INF Treaty was important. And as I say in the Foreign Affairs piece, we need a Russia policy. We need to have some kind of coherent policy toward Russia and China other than whatever the president tweeted 5 minutes ago. It's impossible for professionals to make policy in this administration because no one ever knows what the president's going to say at any given moment. I mean, this is how we lost Secretary Mattis, who finally just said, if we're pulling out of Syria, I can't get behind that policy and I'm leaving. Now, of course, Trump has reversed himself. The president has reversed himself and said, well, maybe we are staying in Syria. No one knows from 1 minute to the next what we're doing, including our allies. And that's very dangerous. Should we have done something about the Iran deal? Yes. Should we have done something about the INF Treaty? Yes. Do we have a perpetual problem of trying to get our NATO partners to engage in more burden sharing? Of course we do. That's a 60-year-old problem. That's just part of being the leader of the free world. Should we do something to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific? Yes. none of these solutions are good solutions because they are all piecemeal, halting, driven by tweet kind of, off the handle sort of things that come out here and there from a president who is mostly just obsessed with his own media and legal problems. So I think we're hamstrung in all this by not having a set of coherent policies that allows the rest of the government to function normally. I mean, if you asked me right now, what is the Trump administration foreign policy? What is our policy toward Russia? What is our policy toward China? I can't answer you. I don't know. I could have told you what Obama's was and then added, and generally I don't like it, but it was identifiable. I knew what it was. I knew what it was about. I didn't happen to like it. I don't think we've been this adrift in foreign policy ever. And I think our opponents are not giving, they're not, and it's not their job to give us any breathing space here. We are obsessed with our own internal problems, including what Russian interference in our democratic institutions. And we simply don't have the attention span to be dealing with a very complicated world. And I think this is going to lead us, this goes back to what I was saying about expertise, this could lead us back to a disaster. I mean, the North Koreans look like they may be readying for another missile launch. The Russians have made direct threats about renuclearizing the European battlefield. They are still holding Ukrainian ships and sailors. They are still sitting on chunks of a sovereign neighbor and sitting on their territory in the middle of a hot war right in the center of Europe. The Iranians continue to be the source of unconscionable mischief and terrorism, and I think have not given up their nuclear ambitions. And the United States, in a sense, I suppose I'll close on this and then I'd be happy to take your questions. In a sense, what we're getting a look at is not just happens when you deplore expertise, because the president's made it very clear. He doesn't think very much of experts, thinks he can live without them, doesn't think they have much to add. And he has vowed to run an administration without experts, and that's exactly what he's doing. But this is also what happens. This is a world without America. This is what happens when you get America basically walking off the world stage and going AWOL and leaving the rest of the world, both our allies and our enemies, to fend for themselves. And I think we're, after 2020, whoever is president, might still be President Trump, whoever is going to be dealing with this in the next few years got a hell of a mess on their hands, and they're going to need more expert advice and to focus on these issues more than we have until now. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
Okay, Tom, before we go to Q&A, I think you would agree to talk about the broad issue of U.S. military preparedness vis-a-vis Russia and China. Big subject, but could you give us your thoughts on that? You know, Russia now has the S-400 missile defense system. They're selling it to everybody in the neighborhood, and they've got the new ICBM threat from Putin, who loves to tell us he can zap us if he feels like doing it one day or other. So let's talk about that if we could.
Well, I'll start with Russia and say that the new ICBM threat is a lot of hooey. It just is. I mean, the Russians, that video he showed looked like it was made by Cruise Missile Simulator for Microsoft. The Russians, first of all, they're limited by the New START treaty when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons. And that's a treaty they actually like, and they should like it, and we should like it because it's a good treaty. Now, President Trump has said he's not sure he wants to stay in that one either. If the New START treaty goes down, then all bets are off, and we're back to where we were in the late 1960s, arms racing each other with nuclear weapons, which I think is would be stupid. But Putin is going to Putin. That's what he does. He gets up there and he says, I 15 years ago, I remember I was teaching a class and this very same question came up because Putin talked about how the Russians now had highly maneuverable warheads that could duck and chuck and jive and jink and get away from, look, any anybody who has an ICBM can destroy New York. That's not hard to do. ICBMs, let's put it this way. ICBMs are technology that are older than I am. And if someone wants to shoot a missile with a large nuclear payload on it, it's a matter of just getting the technology right. The number of countries that could build nuclear weapons is much higher than the number of countries that have. And so Putin's bluster about new generations of super duper, I mean, at some point he's going to claim he's built a Death Star. I mean, it's just going to happen. That's just how Putin is. With that said, I think the Russians can muster a great deal of conventional force in localized areas that will overwhelm us temporarily. If the Russians really want to march into the Baltics or take a chunk of Poland or tangle with the Germans, they can do it, but they can't do it for long. The Russian military is actually quite brittle, and they know it. That's one of the reasons they're relying on nuclear saber-rattling threats. My answer to this is, if the Russians take a piece of Estonia, 2 weeks from now, we're going to make them give it back. And at that point, they will make nuclear threats. Well, that depends on how seriously you want to take them. I would argue that we need to invest more, not in nuclear weapons, which seems to be the direction the Trump administration is going, but in conventional weapons, stronger NATO conventional presence. The Pacific, I think, is a more worrisome situation, because we've been underinvesting in the Navy in the Pacific. Our people out there, again, important to say, I don't represent the Navy. I think our people out there are just being overworked and exhausted by the fact that we don't have enough conventional force to put out there. I think if you really want to make the Chinese nervous, you shouldn't be building intermediate range nuclear missiles. You should be building more ships. In the end, the way you control an ocean is with ships, not with missiles. And we shy away from these things because they're expensive. And again, experts will tell you this, but the public says, oh, well, that wasn't really the answer I wanted. The answer I wanted was magic beans that we can plant on an island that will grow a navy. And it doesn't work that way. It takes a long time and a lot of investment to create a navy. I think, the Army has been stressed and exhausted by multiple deployments. We forget that we're overseas in a war. The president has promised to end those wars, but you're not going to end American engagement in the Middle East and Central Asia. I mean, that's to me, that's childlike thinking, to think that you're just going to bring all the boys home and let it take care of itself. And I think this is a delusion that both Trump and to some extent President Obama shared. President Obama said, the big problem for American foreign policy is that we're too engaged in the Middle East. We'll make a deal with the Russians. We'll cut a deal with the Iranians, and we'll just kind of accept that the Russians and the Iranians are going to fill that vacuum in the Middle East. And that's just going to end up sucking us right back in there. I think Americans don't understand that preparedness and keeping the world a stable place that works to our advantage. Remember, the United States created this system of global trade and peace and cooperation, and it is to our advantage that it keep operating. You can't do that by simply pulling up stakes and coming home and saying, well, best of luck to everyone, because eventually what you'll find is that as we did in the 70s, you'll find that the rest of the world doesn't think it's their job to help us out. I'm old enough to remember the oil embargo of the 1970s. When a superpower collapses, as we did for a time in 1974 and 75, what you get is a group of oil-producing states deciding to choke off your lifeline, the Soviet Union running rampant throughout Central Asia, even into Africa. We forget that there was a time where the Soviets were sitting in Afghanistan, and there were East Germans and Cubans running all throughout sub-Saharan Africa as though somehow that were normal. There were communist revolutions taking place, aided by weapons in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador and Grenada. The picture between 1975 and 1980 was really quite grim. And I think it's only through good luck and by a highly productive economy and the absence of a Soviet Union that we've escaped that fate right now. But I think we're headed right back toward that. I think the United States is back where it was somewhere around the mid 1970s in terms of our power and influence in the world. And people aren't going to like that. If China decides, for example, that it is going to be the guarantor of the global maritime commons, trust me, you're not going to like that. Then it's not going to be a situation Americans are going to be comfortable with. And they will be looking back to moments like right now and saying, why didn't any of you people do anything about this? But it's always a tough sell to talk about the long term and the need for investment and patience and stick-to-itiveness and perseverance. So I don't worry that much about our readiness with the Russians. I worry about a Black Swan event. That's where I'll stop on this and say, I worry about the unexpected crisis that flares up in some part of the world that nobody saw coming, either by accident, somebody shoots down an airplane or goes into the wrong airspace or something blows up somewhere. And I'm particularly worried about it right now because I don't think this White House can handle a normal news day. And I certainly don't think it can handle a major international crisis. The collapse of the Hanoi summit was a good example of what happens when you walk into a complicated international situation and you don't know what you're doing. And you don't do your homework, you don't prepare, and you just walk in thinking you're going to kind of make a deal like you're buying a casino, and you end up having to walk out. I would argue with things actually being worse now than they were a year and a half ago. So.
Great, thanks. Okay, let me ask the first real question, official question. The Russians have interfered in Syria, as you know. Are they in over their heads? I mean, it sure looks like they've got so many different elements to deal with: the Iranians, the Israelis popping missiles off at Iranian installations in Syria, and so forth and so on. Do you think the Russians have gotten so involved that they may regret it?
No.
No.
No, absolutely not. The Russians are in a strategic situation they could only have dreamed of 30 or 40 years ago. The goal of American foreign policy for 3/4 of a century was to keep the Russians, to keep the Kremlin out of the Middle East. They now have a situation in which we have actually invited them in, handed them the keys to the place, and said, see how you can do. We're out of here. So I don't for a moment believe they're in over their heads, in part because we haven't made it a situation in which they're in over their heads. We could stress the Russians a lot harder overseas if we felt like it, if we really felt like doing it. But we just don't have the attention span or the willingness to do it. And so, no, I don't think the Russians are in over their head. They come and go as they please. They try out new weapons. They try out their tactics. Their pilots are getting some important flying time. And when things get a little rough, they pull back for a bit. As long as Assad stays in power and their relationship with the Iranians stays relatively cooperative, this is all gravy for them. This is something they never expected to get. So, the idea of imperial overextension or getting in over their heads, it just doesn't apply to the Russians because this is for them. This is the bonus round. They never thought they'd be here. This is the luckiest break they've gotten since the end of the Cold War, and so they're running with it. No, I don't think they're in over their heads at all.
They've got to balance the Iranians with the Israelis, right? So how does that work out?
Pardon?
Balance the Iranian inroads with Israel's response.
Well, the Israelis and the Russians are getting along fine. Netanyahu goes to Moscow. He has a good relationship with Putin. This notion that it's still like 1980 and this is the Soviet Union and we're playing this kind of calculated game of risk. Look, the United States is out of the game and the other players are getting together and talking to each other. Netanyahu, Putin, the Iranians, Assad, they're all talking to each other. They're all, and now the Israelis, you know, when Putin gets off the handle, the Israelis, without thinking twice about it, go right in and punch Putin in the nose. Punch Assad in the nose. And the Russians say, you know, every now and then you got to take a beating. They're not killing Russians. They're not, you know, they're staying. In fact, again, you know, they're talking with the Russians. This is the best foreign policy situation the Kremlin's been in, I would say, maybe ever. And so this, you know, at least since the end of the Cold War, and maybe even before that. So this notion that the Russians are getting in over their head, I think, is doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't. That's not the facts on the ground.
Okay, I'm sure we got some more questions from the audience.
Tom, can we go back to the Pacific? And the question I'd like to ask really has to do with asking you as a faculty member, how do you teach about the projection of power? We hear, for example, our last speaker talked about the relationship of the TPP or the non-TPP in terms of our ability to project power, even more than putting another carrier group in. Can you explain to us a little bit more about the projection of power, what affects it? What are you trying to get your military students to understand as they go to their next assignment? What should we understand about the projection of power?
I only picked up part of that question. I'm sorry. It was about, could you, Tyler, can you rephrase that
really,
for me?
We hear that here in our group, we hear a number of our, quote, experts who come to us talk about the projection of power.
A projection of power, okay.
And what does it mean? What affects it? So, for example, a recent speaker said to us, the failure of the TPP, or our pulling out of the TPP, has a significant implication in the Pacific over our ability to project power. Can you explain that a little bit to us? What is that all about, and what are you teaching your students?
Well, what affects our ability to project power is to have the systems that allow us to project power, particularly things like ships and carriers and expeditionary forces. But power is more than just muscle. There's an intangible to power. Pulling out of TPP was a bad idea. It's always better to be in the game, influencing it from the inside than to be cut out of it. And once again, it does make it more difficult for us to maneuver both politically and physically in the Pacific because China's talking with other countries in ways that don't involve us. And so we're the odd man out. And now that's the president sold that as a positive, to be kind of the outcast of the international community, because he made the argument that community doesn't serve our interests. I think that's wrong. And I think that our approach to multilateral organizations and agreements like TPP does limit our ability to project not just military power, but to project political and cultural power, because now, the worst thing in international affairs is to be ignored. Power. When I was in grad school, one of the things we learned was that one definition of power is the ability to make other people take you into account in their calculations. That if other people have to think about you and think about what you want, then by definition you have power. Well, the United States has voluntarily chosen a situation in which, the Chinese and a lot of other people in the Pacific just don't have to think about us. And I think that's a self-inflicted choice. So I do think that we have limited our ability to project all kinds of power, not just military power.
Recently I've heard media reports about U.S. missiles with a dramatically reduced nuclear capability, I think in the 5 kiloton range. And this was said to be stabilizing. I don't know if they were being proposed or in some stage of development. I was just wondering if you have heard anything about that, and if so, if you could comment on it.
The range of our missiles and stability, but then you broke up there from.
Not the range of missiles. I've heard about the either the development or proposed development of U.S. ballistic missiles with a dramatically reduced, strength in the 5 kiloton range is what I recall. So I just wonder, and they were said to the concern was that this would be stabilizing because it lowered the threshold for nuclear engagement. I just wonder if you've heard anything about that, or what's your opinion of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to. We don't have a new generation of missiles, but it depends on what you're talking about.
Yeah, it would have been a redeployment of existing missiles, but a dramatic downgrading of the payload.
A dramatic downgrade
Of the payload. Of the nuclear warhead.
Of the payload.
Payload. Oh, low yield nuclear warheads. I think that's a terrible idea, in part because it's an attempt to solve, this is kind of when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail problem. One of the responses that's been suggested and that we've already embarked upon doing, apparently, one of the responses to dealing with Russian conventional threats or with Russian nuclear threats in the European theater is to put very low yield nuclear weapons on top of submarine launched missiles, so that we can say to the Russians or to the Chinese, apparently, if you start something, we don't have to start World War III. We can use these very small, very precise nuclear weapons on you, and without escalating this into a larger conflict. I think that idea is nuts. I think once you use a nuclear weapon, you use the nuclear weapon. As Henry Kissinger once said, there's a kind of virginity about nuclear weapons that once you've crossed that line, you're not going back. And I think it's a crutch that says, well, we don't really want to solve this problem, and we don't really want to spend the money on conventional forces, and we still want to be able to throw our weight around and squeeze some juice out of this nuclear lemon somehow. So we'll put very small warheads on submarines. There's one huge problem, by the way, that with submarine launched warheads, that no matter what size they are, an enemy watching that cannot tell how big that warhead is or what it's aimed at. And so you can tell your opponent, well, we're just launching this submarine with a 0.5 kiloton on it. Don't worry about it. If a prudent opponent is going to assume that if he sees a submarine at launch depth and missiles pop out of the water, he's going to assume it's go time, that it's World War III. And I think there's in the people in the nuclear strategy community who do this kind of stuff, I think the people who argue for this are guilty of really an amazing amount of hubris, that they believe that somehow they have the wherewithal to control the enemy's perceptions and to control escalation and to clearly message to the opponent that this isn't going to get out of hand. I think all that's nonsense. I think once you start throwing nuclear weapons around, you've opened Pandora's box and you're courting a Holocaust. And so this small yield warhead on submarine launch missiles, I think is really one of the worst ideas I've seen in a long time, and that's saying something, because this debate has been characterized over the past few years by a lot of bad ideas.
Okay, two things before I get to my question on false equivalence. One, should Trump's motto really be "Make America Puny Again"? Seems to me that's what's happened in the international arena. Two, when people cite the internet to me, I respond, you have to be careful in referring to the internet, because not everything on the internet is wrong. Now, false equivalence. Do you think the press's tendency to say, on the other hand, other people say, like, for example, with respect to climate change, yeah, the experts say this, but on the other hand, there are people who believe the opposite. Is that playing a role in the decline of respect for expertise?
Okay, let me back up to your two comments. You asked, should Trump make America what again?
Puny.
Puny. Yeah, withdrawing from this, withdrawing from that.
I think I just don't think there's ever been such a decline, at least not since the end of Vietnam. We've never lived through a period of such self-inflicted decline in America's stature in the world. I mean, I've just never seen anything like it. You know, Vietnam, the 70s were a confluence of events. I mean, remember, our economy was flat on its back. We had lost in Vietnam. The Soviet Union was at the top of its game militarily. But I've just never seen us commit this kind of diplomatic, this kind of self-inflicted diplomatic wounds. So I'm not sure what the president's, I don't think the president knows what his foreign policy is, to be honest with you. The thing that always makes the most sense to me when trying to unpack the president's policies is that I don't think he intended to win the election. I really believe that. I think that he was as surprised on election night as anyone, and just don't think he was ready for it, and I don't think they ever recovered from that. The other was, you said something about being careful about the internet. Are you talking about, was it something about corporate interests?
No. When people say, I saw on the internet that blah, 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 I say you have to be careful in referring to the internet, because not everything on the internet is wrong.
Right. Not everything on the internet is wrong, but most things aren't very good. When someone says, I saw it on the internet, one of the things I find most frustrating when talking to people is when someone says something that is flatly just wrong or even bizarre, and I say, where did you learn this? And they say, well, I read things. I read things. Well, what it means is I was bored and I was clicking around on the internet and I found this thing and it stuck in my head. I think if you say to me, look, the internet isn't so bad, my answer is, yeah, if you're using it to read the Washington Post, it's actually quite good. If you're using it to visit the website of a Nobel Prize winner and have him explain to you what he does, that's great. I don't let my students use Wikipedia as a source generally, but I love Wikipedia, as I say in the book. I love Wikipedia because for some reason, the plot and cast of every movie ever made, no matter how small or stupid, is on the internet. And somebody wrote about it on Wikipedia. I've turned into my father, who used to keep an almanac around to say, I wonder how old that actor is, you know? And so I love watching some old movie that I have no idea about and saying, I wonder what year that was made. I can open up Wikipedia. But by and large, the internet is really some pretty rocky territory to try to negotiate. And you have to be careful with it. But your point about the media trying to, do the both sides thing and to be even-handed. I think, when it comes to scientific fact, yeah, the climate debate, is the climate changing? Yes. Do we know why it's changing? We think so. Where I think it's still useful to have a one side, other side debate is what to do about it. Because I think people, I didn't write a lot about climate change in the book because there's very few debates in American politics that I hate more than the climate change debate, because it's a matter of religion for everybody involved now. There's just no rational discussion about it, because the science can only tell you so much. The rest is a question of policy. And I think it's okay to have people debate, do we want to make sure Boston doesn't slide into the harbor in 50 years? Or do we want to have, not spend the money right now? That's a policy debate. That scientists can't really help you with that. I agree with you that when there's some matter of scientific fact and they go and they find one crackpot who says, well, I'm the one guy who doesn't believe it, and 99-1 is supposed to look like 50-50, I think is a disservice. On the other hand, there are real debates that are not simply resolved by scientific fact. I mean, I've heard people make the argument that, okay, the climate's changing, but I prefer to invest in other priorities right now, That's an argument. You can disagree with it. You can think it's not particularly moral, but there are people who say, look, if Boston slides into the harbor in 100 years, I get it. we'll build Boston somewhere else, but I'm not going to change anything right now. That's an argument worth having. Whether the moon is made of green cheese, or I recently was in a TV report about flat earthers. No, we don't need 50-50 debates on whether the earth is flat. The earth is round. I think we can all take it for, as written, that the earth is in fact a sphere of some kind. But I think, saying the earth, just down that line of reasoning, saying the earth is round doesn't lead you to an obvious answer about what to do about manned space flight and whether we should invest in it. And I think that's where the networks can do a better job. But yeah, sometimes they fall into that, well, most people believe one thing, so we have to find the one guy who doesn't. Let me add one other thing. The problem with the media is it's you, us, the crowd. We like those gladiatorial games. We want to see people argue. We tune in. We give those shows ratings. We love them. We don't want to see 4 or 5 people having a pleasant conversation about important matters of public policy. We tune in those evenings, whether it's Chris Cuomo and Matt Schlapp yelling at each other, or Rachel Maddow spinning out, highly complicated theories that I generally don't understand, or, Sean Hannity losing his mind and yelling at people. That's what gets ratings. Hannity and Maddow, and, they're highly rated shows. They cater to a particular viewpoint. I don't think they're equivalent. Obviously, I think Rachel Maddow is a lot smarter than Sean Hannity. And if I had to only watch one of them, I would watch Rachel Maddow. I don't even watch Hannity anymore. But those fights and that yelling, people want that stuff. And unfortunately, the problem with American consumerism is we get what we want and we pay for it.
Other questions?
Yeah, you got into the issue of climate change.
I'm sorry.
You got into the issue of.
It is on. You need to speak. You need to speak right into it. Really close.
Okay.
Tyler, could you repeat
Okay.
that question for me?
Yeah, he's adjusting the mic,
topic of,
so I think he's okay now.
climate change, which I was going to raise anyway. What would be some of your speculation on some of the foreign policy aspects if the United States got into doing something about climate change fully, rather than some people talking about it, but actually trying to do something about it? What would some of the foreign policy consequences be, or could be, if we really got serious about climate change?
Well, I think if you really are going to be serious about climate change, then you really have to be serious about international cooperation, because there's no way the United States is going to do this alone. The United States, in a lot of areas, the United States is not actually the problem. I mean, the problem is places like China and India and, countries that are still in full industrialization mode. Russia, which, doesn't much care about the climate. I think it's
Russia's
typically
worried about the price of oil.
Sorry?
Russia's worried about the price of oil.
Worried about the price of oil, Russians.
Yeah. And the Arctic. Russia's already, counting on the Arctic to have more waterways and more melting, and so they're building up forces to, go and make sovereign claims on the North Pole. But the idea that somehow, I think this is typically an American kind of self-absorbed American approach that says, well, the way we're going to solve climate change around the world is that we're not going to let people have plastic straws. That we're going to make you pay for an extra bag at CVS. If you're really going to get serious about climate change, then you're going to have to, name and shame. And you're going to have to get out there and find the people that really are, putting a lot of burning a lot of carbon and putting a lot of emissions into the air, and that's going to require a lot of diplomacy. Making a cleaner world. And let me just add, by the way, that one of the things that I think younger people who believe that the planet is somehow irredeemably poisoned forget is that the planet is far cleaner than it was when I was a boy. This is, every generation begins with the assumption that nothing happened until they got here. And it makes me crazy. I grew up on the banks of the Connecticut River in the Connecticut Valley in Massachusetts. I grew up near Springfield, Massachusetts. The Connecticut River was filthy. It was horrifying. It glowed at night. I mean, it was like The Simpsons with the three-eyed fish. There are now Atlantic salmon coming all the way back up to Vermont. There is more forested space in the United States again. People are hitting deer where you live in places like Westchester County. Instead of the big urban sprawl in which we're supposed to all be eating Soylent Green and living in 100 square feet, people are driving home from New York City and they're hitting deer that have reappeared in the suburbs of New York. So I think, I tend to be, because by my temperament, I am a conservative, I tend not to overreact and panic about these things. I've already lived through multiple periods where the world was supposed to end already. However, climate change, it's a real thing. The commitment to it has to be, in some sense, scientific, but in a large sense, diplomatic, because it doesn't help us if we're telling people, in diners in Queens that they can't have straws, or your local CVS is getting on your back about taking an extra plastic bag, and we're not somehow working with China and India and Brazil and Russia and a lot of other places. And so I think that, I think part of the thing I really don't like about the climate change is that people on every side of it act like spoiled children. The climate deniers are literally say things like, science doesn't know anything. The scientists are all a bunch of left-wing charlatans, which isn't true. On the other hand, there are people on the left who are, many of them young, who say things have never been this bad, the planet is in immediate danger, and 12 years from now, we're all going to be dead. That's not a real debate. I think I look forward to us getting past this point in our politics where we start having real conversations about important ideas like adults. And the climate debate is not one of them. But I'll just, my last comment on this is also my first comment. If you really want to get serious about climate change, you have to get serious about diplomacy, not just science.
Okay, we've got a question there. Yeah.
I have seen a lot of reports that the United States is vulnerable to EMP. Brings up two questions. One, are we? And the second is, if EMP is real, why isn't it something that we could use over, for example, North Korea?
Your question was, if EMP is real, why isn't it what?
If it's real,
yeah.
Okay, what is the threat, the true threat to the United States, and why can't or why don't we use it on North Korea?
Against North Korea, okay. Well, first of all, EMP is a real thing. It's a side effect of a nuclear weapon. We didn't really understand EMP until the early 1960s when we blew off a giant H-bomb test in the Pacific, and it blew out street lights in Honolulu because the bomb was bigger than we thought it would be. Oops, it was the early days of nuclear testing above ground. EMP ionizes the atmosphere, and it pumps voltage through things. So it doesn't hurt you because it's not amperage, it doesn't electrocute you, but it creates this big voltage surge that just blows out all your electronics, and anything with a computer chip, and anything that relies on, it starts fires and all that stuff. So it's real. Can it be used as a weapon? Yeah, I guess it could, although I think this is mostly something that has come up in the fevered imagination of Newt Gingrich and the House Republicans back in the 90s, who, written even Gingrich, even one of Gingrich's co-authors even wrote a science fiction book about it. The fear here is that if someone explodes an EMP weapon, that is a nuclear weapon that has been altered to pump out a lot of electromagnetic pulse, which is what EMP stands for, that you can kind of turn America back to the Stone Age. This is nonsense for a lot of reasons, including the fact that a lot of things in the world are shielded from EMP, and also that we know how to make replacements for things. It would be a huge pain in the ass, and it would hurt a lot of people. Airplanes would fall out of the sky. People in hospitals would die. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff that could happen with an EMP burst over the United States. But what the EMP cult out there seems to forget is an EMP weapon is a nuclear bomb. In order to do this, you would have to explode a nuclear weapon on top of the United States. So it's not like this is some special weapon that you get a pass for using because it's not really a nuke. It's a nuclear bomb. During the Cold War, we just assumed that the first wave of a Soviet attack against NATO and the United States would be the use of nuclear weapons in high altitude detonations that would burn out our communications. And that was part of the strategy. The Soviet Union attacked NATO and subsequently wanted to launch a salvo against the United States. First thing that would have happened is you would have had high altitude nuclear bursts that would have just burned out all the lights and shut off all the televisions and all the computers and all that stuff. But it's still a nuclear bomb. I don't think it's worth it to an opponent to try and do this, because there are a lot of things that are not vulnerable to EMP, including submarines that have nuclear weapons on them that can retaliate. Your question about why don't we use it against North Korea is because we are a decent country that is not going to launch an unprovoked nuclear attack and kill millions of people, because people will die from things like the power grid going down, from airplane. Look, when we sold technology to the Soviet Union that helped them with things like air traffic control, which of course was in our interest as well, we didn't bug that software. We didn't mess with that stuff because we didn't want Soviet airplanes falling out of the sky. If we're going to go to war with North Korea, an EMP weapon is really that's a ridiculous, that's killing a mosquito with a sledgehammer, because the other problem with EMP is at some point its effects hurt a lot of other people. It'll affect all of the air traffic going through that area. It would bleed over into Russia and China, would do a lot of damage there. I mean, it's just a big sloppy weapon that doesn't make any sense, except, again, the House Republicans held endless hearings on this because they were trying to figure out how they could put North Korea and Iran with a missile program in the role of being an existential threat to the United States. Once the Soviets were out of the game, and especially during the 90s when we had a good relationship with the Russians, and the Chinese didn't really have a particularly large nuclear arsenal yet, there were a lot of attempts to fill that space with saying, now how do we develop this sense of urgency about threats to the United States? We'll talk about EMP weapons that can reduce us all to year zero if they're exploded over the United States. Of all the things that I worry about, an EMP weapon is really, really low on my list of priorities. Because the other thing you have to think about is if someone is actually going to attack the United States with an EMP weapon, a nuclear bomb detonated at high altitude over the United States, we're already at war with somebody at that point. And we're probably in a nuclear conflict with somebody at that point. So this notion of, just sneaking one in when we're not looking and turning us all into, making America into 1921, I think is just alarmism. The fact that Newt Gingrich is its biggest proponent should tell you something.
Okay, we have another question. Yeah.
I found your comments at the beginning about education very, very interesting, particularly since we seem to be going downward in education as the world becomes more complex. In fact, you know, there seems to be some research that suggests that the reason the United States had a good 20th century is that in the early part of the 20th century, we probably had better education than many other countries. My question now is, given what's happened, that we seem to care that Johnny feels good and not whether he knows anything, the question would be, what do you think this is going to do to the future of the United States, and is there any way to turn it around at this point?
I'm going to take issue with at least some of what you said about the 20th century, because remember, it was not a universal thing to graduate from high school really until after World War II. Universal high school education, almost nobody went to until after World War II and the baby boom. Almost nobody went to college, and most people didn't graduate or had some high school. I mean, my family, neither one of my parents were high school graduates. They were a Depression era family. So, you know, in the book, I talk about how back in 1941, the New York Times was decrying how stupid the inductees were, you know, for World War II, that they they thought Abraham Lincoln was the first president and that he emaciated the slaves. So there's always been a complaint about kind of how stupid kids are. I think what's different now and what's dangerous is that we actually have, this is going to sound weird to say it, too much education. We have universal high school education that has been reduced to a lowest common denominator in some places of almost like daycare. And so we now have people like Bernie Sanders arguing for universal college education as a recognition that high school doesn't mean very much anymore. I have been banging the drum for years of trying to tell people not to waste their money on college if they would be happier or more productive going into things like trades. Marco Rubio tried to bring this up, one of the few bright moments of the primary season, when he said, you know, the world needs more welders than philosophers. You know, I don't think it helps you. As a friend of mine recently, her daughter wanted to spend over $50,000 a year going to UConn to study art history. I don't think that's a good life choice. And I think what's happened is that the colleges, which are floating on an endless supply of government guaranteed funding and loans, are turning into glorified high schools. Not only that, but if you may notice, and I talk about this in the book, how many small colleges are rebranding themselves as universities. I don't know if that's happening in New York, where you guys live. Where I live here in New England, every small college has decided to take college out of its name and become a university. When I was taught very briefly at LaSalle in Philadelphia, and Beaver College, which, you know, among young men was always a kind of a snickering joke back when I was a kid, is now Arcadia University. It's still the same place. I mean, it's tiny, and I'm sure it's a perfectly good school, but it's not. You know, they're all calling themselves universities like they have a particle collider behind the cafeteria. That's to up their game, to bring in foreign students, and to appeal to students who don't want to go to a college. They want to be able to say, I'm a graduate of a university. And it's making them, again, believe that they have more knowledge than they do. And it's making them resistant to learning once they get out of college. They say, well, I'm a pretty smart guy. I went to, Rhode Island State University. And when in fact, what they've done is they've kind of picked up a lot of skills that they should have learned in high school, because the high schools can't deal with the number of students that they're getting. I think one answer to this is to de-emphasize college and to re-emphasize high school, and to stop, to get rid of the schools of education, to get rid of the people who do nothing but study metrics. Because what we really have now is a lot of, I mean, my daughter's in high school right now, she's 15, and I see it all the time. this teaching to the test problem. My daughter can tell you all about a bunch of Supreme Court cases because they're going to be on a standardized state test. She just can't tell you about the Supreme Court because they don't cover that. But they say, you have to know Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, memorize that. And when you encounter it on a standardized exam, know it. This, to me, is using high schools as a holding pattern before some kids go off to work and the rest, way too many of them, go to college, or as I call it, college, when really it's kind of just, warehousing you for, or holding you in a kind of holding pattern before adulthood for 4 to 6 years. There's a quote I put in the book from somebody who went to I can't name the school because I don't want to slam them too hard, but a well-known party school in California. He referred to college as those magical 7 years between high school and your first warehouse job. That's got to end. There comes a time to say, look, maybe going to college isn't a good idea. Maybe you should think about being a welder or a plumber or a tailor or a graphic arts person or retail sales or something. But this notion that 4 years of kind of deferring adulthood instead of actually learning something. Now, let me just add one more thing about college. This is not about turning everything into STEM. I have a graduate degree in government. I don't want to live in a world full of STEM majors. I want there to be people who study French medieval poetry. But I don't think that should be everybody. And I don't think that we should be sending kids into loan guaranteed 4 or 5 or 6 year holding patterns that leave them deeply in debt. This bubble is going to burst. The housing bubble popped. The education bubble is next. And when it happens, remember, you heard it here first, but that bubble is going to pop. We're not going to be able to guarantee all those loans. Kids are going to stop going to school and start doing some other things. It will cause more class inequality in America for a time, I think. But I think that's probably a necessary price to pay for clearing out all these kind of make-believe programs in things like communications. Now, communications is a real thing. I went to a college that I didn't go there, but my university, I went to Boston University. It had an excellent school of public communications. But the default major, it is one of the 3 most common non-STEM majors in America, is to default to communications because it can mean anything. And then kids get out of college and they say, oh, I have a degree in communications. Well, then I would like fries with that. And, I would like my latte to be a decaf. And I think that's a cruel thing to do to kids. And so we need to have more, I think the other thing too, adults need to become more involved in this. We are talking to 16 and 17-year-olds. And I talk about this at length in the book. We are asking them how they want to spend the next 5 years, 4 or 5 years of their lives, and at least $250,000. And we're asking this of 16-year-olds, which I think is crazy. One piece of advice, and then I'll stop going on about this. I know maybe many of you in the audience have, college-age kids, and they're going to want to do the tour, right? Where you get especially here on the East Coast. They want to get in the car and they want to start at Orono up at the University of Maine or McGill in Montreal, and they're going to drive all the way down the East Coast, and they want to see Boston, and they're going to want to see, Brown and Providence College, and then go through New Haven, down through New York, and end up down at, William and Mary or the University of Richmond. As a college professor of 30 years experience, let me tell you, don't do it. Don't do it, because kids fall in love with colleges for irrational reasons. I've had kids in my family. A lot of people I've seen go through this misery where the student says, I want to go to college, this particular college because I was there on a beautiful day and the quad was pretty and the pizza was good and I could just envision, because students think of college as like getting married. They think it's forever. As I told my own godson when he got hooked on a particular college that he ended up not going to, by the way, I said, listen, there are people that have car loans that are going to last longer than your college experience. There are people that have leases on their cars that are going to go longer than you're in college. So adults need to get involved with this and take charge here.
Okay, Tom, let me ask the last question, if I could. Back to foreign policy. We hear a lot about an entente between China and Russia. It probably isn't really happening, but, you know, Xi Jinping now calls Putin his best friend, quote unquote, for PR purposes. But they are acting a little bit more like they can get along better. And are there any implications to such an entente for our, our foreign policy vis-a-vis them, et cetera?
The Russian-China entente problem has been around for about 30 years now, particularly since the end of the Cold War. It's always low on my list of worries because as a Russia specialist, the one thing I can tell you is that for cultural, historical, and in some cases completely irrational reasons, the Russians and the Chinese pretty much hate each other. And I don't think they're going to overcome that. They are natural competitors rather than allies. I give you a great example of this. I was in Moscow some years ago. I was watching Russian television, and there was a joint exercise that the Russians and the Chinese were conducting together. And, you know, it went okay. I mean, it was something about, you know, humanitarian assistance and all that. And the Russian general was trying to be very complimentary. And he says, you know, our Chinese comrades, our Chinese colleagues, they're very good. They're very organized, like ants, really. And you know, he thought he was saying something really nice by saying our Chinese colleagues they're good comrades. They're very organized. They're like ants. I think that this again is a world without America. This is what happens when the Americans take a powder and just exit the world stage. You know, of course the Russians and the Chinese are getting along with each other. Why shouldn't they? They're basically saying, look, there's a lot of smaller powers around each of us that are scared to death of us. So, you know, like two mafia bosses who are never going to be in this allied. You know, if you've seen The Godfather, you understand 90% of everything that happens in the world of international relations. These are two mob families who are, you know, Xi and Putin looking at each other saying, listen, probably best that your interests and mine don't, you know, run up against each other. You know, why don't we have a cordial relationship? You do oil, you know, we'll do drugs and patent infringements, and you handle mostly the Europeans, and we'll stay out of that. So this notion that we're going to be facing this, you know, Sino-Soviet or Russo-Sino entente that's going to drive us, I don't worry about that. But they're getting along better.
So thanks again. Thanks again.